record this because I'm not the host. Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everybody. Good evening. I hope you are all doing well. I really wanted to address, I was going to do this in a couple of different classes, but I think we'll just try to do it in one, and hopefully be able to cover the most important parts of this. But I feel like there's just a lot of lack of clarity among people, meaning even us, certainly non-Jewish people and people who, quote unquote, support the Palestinian cause. Just a lot of lack of information. There's a lot of mythology about what Israel is and was, and what Zionism is, and who was here in Israel, and the Palestinian land, and all of these things. I'd really like to try to give just a very clear overview of the history, and along the way we'll address hashkafic issues, halachic issues, different things that have to do with this whole topic. It's very, very important for us to be clear on this. We are the ones who are deeply affected by everything that goes on, and it's not good when we don't have clarity ourselves, that we are left with questions, and are anything that the Palestinians say, is it correct? Is there anything about what they say that is true, and what's not true, and how it all works? Last week we spoke about some of the blatant lies that they say, and the incredible damage that those cause, and it's been going on like that for 100 years. But I want to go now more just into the chronology, into the history, a bit of how this all developed, how we ended up in the situation where we are today. Why is it that there's just like no other country in the world, basically, where there's like a dispute about whose country it is and who should be there and who shouldn't be there? And a lot of us, as religious Jewish people, so we have a perspective like, of course, Israel is ours. This week's parsha, Mamish Parshas Lech Lecha, is all about going to Israel and Avram Avinu being promised the land and all of that. So to us, it makes perfect sense that there's an incredible arc of history, that we were in Israel until the second Beis Hamikdash, and the Romans came and expelled us from Israel, and now we're back, and it's miraculous and it's incredible, but the world obviously doesn't see it that way. So I want to work with this picture, this map, that is a map I'm sure many of you have seen before. This is a map that many Palestinians post and use as a trope to say how much land Israel has stolen from them, and how Israel is just constantly stealing more and more and more. It goes back to this first map here in 1947, which shows like almost the entire Israel, the entire land of Israel that it is today, as all Palestine. It's all belonging to the Arabs. Palestinian land versus Jewish settlements, right? There are like a handful of Jewish settlements within Palestine. And then, in 1947, all of a sudden, boom, this huge area is now Israel and Jewish land, and the Palestinians are only on this tiny stretch of land and this little bit of land. And then comes 1967, and 1949 to 1967. This was the plan, but didn't end up happening, which we'll talk about why. And then, here they are with even less. And then today, that's it. This is, Israel is all the white, and this is after we left Gaza. This little stretch of land over here is Gaza, and here is just little dots and little patches of Palestinian land, and everything else is Israel and occupied land. So I'd really like to use this as a starting point, because this is a very famous picture. This comes in many different forms. I'm sure that some of you guys have seen this before. It comes in many, many different forms and versions of it, but essentially all saying the same thing. So in order to understand what we're talking about, we're going to go back just over 100 years, until before World War I. World War I broke out in the early 1900s. And before World War I, we're going to look at the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire was a huge empire that owned a huge chunk of Asia and Northern Africa. This entire area was owned by the Ottoman Turks, this entire gigantic area. There's a few different maps of it, and this is maybe a clearer map here from pre-World War I Ottoman Empire, right? So you see it has the entire area of Turkey, the entire area of Iraq, the entire area of Israel over here, going deep down here into chunks of Saudi Arabia. This entire area was the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman was as it developed over many years, but it was a Muslim empire. It was the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Its base was in Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, which is the capital of Turkey. But Constantinople was considered to be the capital of this enormous Ottoman Empire. And coming into World War I, this was what it was. This is how the world looked. And there were many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of Jews that lived throughout the Ottoman Empire. That was basically all of the Sephardim, right? The Ashkenazim lived up in these areas, right, in Europe and Eastern Europe and in Italy and, all the other European countries. And the Sephardim lived all throughout the Ottoman Empire. Jewish people thrived under those conditions. They did better, by and large, than they did in Christian Europe over the centuries. We know that in Christian Europe, there were many issues with the Jews throughout the years, many blood libels, and times that Jews were kicked out of many countries, from all over the place over the time. And many times when those Jews were kicked out, especially like during the Inquisition and then during in Spain, so they would be kicked out like in the 1400s, and many of them moved to the Ottoman Empire. Some did go to Poland and other areas in Eastern Europe, but throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Jewish people lived. Now, that's not to say that life was great and easy for them. They were clearly legally second-class citizens. The word in Islam is a jimmi, like D-J-I-M-M-I, something along those lines, which means like officially second class. Like we were allowed to practice our religion. We had to pay a certain tax to them, and we didn't have real legal rights. There's many stories throughout all the Ottoman Empire of Jewish people being persecuted. Jewish people, they really weren't allowed to have legal representation. If there was any sort of a dispute between a Muslim and a Jew, it was almost always that the Muslim would win. They were definitely second-class citizens, definitely downtrodden. This, children would throw rocks at them and spit at them and make fun of them and stuff like that. And there was no recourse. There was nothing that they could do. In fact, a few times where it came up that Jews stood up for themselves, then there were pogroms also throughout the Ottoman Empire at different times. But again, it was not as bad as it was throughout Christian Europe. It was better, but it certainly wasn't great. It was not a great existence, but they lived. That's how Jewish people lived. You and I are from a generation that we can't really, maybe until right now for the first time in the past few weeks, but we can't really understand what it was like to be a Jew for 2,000 years, where you were officially downtrodden, officially and legally and in every which way seen as a lesser, seen as a lower person. This is obviously what fueled a lot of Jewish people over the years converting to Islam, converting to Christianity, trying to escape from being this, second-class person. Obviously, many of us stayed strong, and we know that there were times the Rishonim and the Achronim, Torah thrived throughout all of these time periods. However, it was not a great time to be a Jew. There was never been a time like today where it's just easy and free to be a Jew, and we can do whatever we want and live however we need to live. That just wasn't the case for 2,000 years, basically throughout any of the places that Jewish people lived. That was either under Christian Europe, like here, throughout Germany, Russia, Ukraine, and all of that, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, however, World War I happened. World War I, we know, was the first great world war. I'm not going to get into all of the details as to how it started and what it was, but basically what it was, the Germany and the Ottoman Turks were on one side. Okay, so you had Germany, and this is like showing this map over here is showing like the different sides. You had in Europe, you had Germany and the Austria-Hungary Empire. That was like basically one unified group. And together with the Ottomans, they fought against everybody else, against France, England, Italy, Russia. These were the two sides, like the good sides, the Allied powers were, Russia, France, and England. And the Central powers are, because they're kind of in the middle of the map, were the the bad guys, what we would call in World War I. Okay, so when World War I broke out and this was fighting, it was a terrible, terrible time for Jews. You had many times that Jews were fighting against each other, something that had happened a few times in the past, especially during like the French-Russian wars, but never on this scale. There were tens of thousands of Jews that were drafted into the army on both sides. And many Jewish people died, many Jewish people killed other Jewish people as part of these armies. It was a brutal, terrible time where Jewish people were forced to fight in these armies that were not even, their countries, so to speak. Although by this point in the Europe, the Enlightenment had already happened and Jewish people were granted more freedoms. At this point, they were more free than they were in the Ottoman Empire. However, this World War I was a terrible tragedy for the world, obviously, and also specifically for the Jewish people. There's tshuvos written about it and all sorts of things about the draft and all of this. It was a very, very difficult time for Jewish people throughout World War I. What happened was, we know, is that the Allied powers won. America joined the war, and we won. The good guys won, so to speak. And Germany was defeated. The Austrian-Hungary Empire closed. That's it. It was the end of it. And then that became different countries, Austria and Hungary. And most significantly for our story, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. It crumbled. And there was no more Ottoman Empire. However, how it got to that stage is an important point in our story. The British realized that they wanted to sort of split the Ottomans in their war effort and affect them in a more, that they wouldn't only be fighting a one-sided war. The Ottomans were fighting against these European powers, and the British realized that if they could get the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire to start to fight against them, like to rebel, if they could get a rebellion going, then they would be able to weaken the Ottoman Empire significantly. They would be having to fight a war while at the same time having to divert a lot of forces and powers to quell this rebellion among their own countries. So the British people, there's a famous British spy named Lawrence of Arabia, and he went and he rallied all the Arabs together, which we'll get back to in a second. And at the same time, they wanted very much to get the Americans involved in the war. And it's almost like a very anti-Semitic trope. The British thought that if they could appeal to the Jews, so the Jews would be able to force America or push America to get into the war. And this is when the Balfour Declaration was delivered in 1917. So that we see over here. First on the bottom here is just an interesting, piece of history. These are British posters, getting the Jews to enlist in the British army to fight in World War I, right? The Jews the world over love liberty, have fought for it, and will fight for it. Britain expects every son of Israel to do his duty, enlist with the infantry reinforcements, right? This is in English, and here's in Yiddish, the exact same sign. In Yiddish, encouraging the Jews. You see, here's a Jew having his shackles cut off from him, like Europe freed the Jews from their shackles, and now it's time to fight for our freedom. So the British was really, really trying to get the Jews to fight against the Ottomans, including the Jews that were in Israel. There were Jews in Israel at this time, and the British were trying to get them to also take part in fighting against the Ottomans, which they did. In an effort to make this happen, Lord Balfour, who was a person who was very much considered an anti-Semite, he was, not known as a good person or a good guy or a Jew lover. However, because of their desire to get the Jewish people around the world galvanized, to get them to rally around the cause of fighting against the Ottomans, so in November of 1917, they released the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is something that's famous. And it says over here, I'll read it to you. It says, "Dear Lord Rothschild," the Rothschild family was one of the most wealthy, influential British families at the time. And he tells him, "I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet." Meaning the Zionist cause was started in the late 1800s by Herzl. We'll talk about that along the way in a minute, but that was a political movement. It was totally not religious. If anything, it was anti-religious. But it was a movement that wanted to rally the Jews to move to Israel, and that we should have our own state, our own country, and to be like a modern European secular country, just like the other European countries. This is what Herzl thought would end anti-Semitism. Originally, he thought, that assimilation and even conversion would help the Jewish cause and end the Jewish question. The Jewish question was always, what to do about the Jews throughout all of Europe. And then Herzl changed tacks and he said, let's make our own state. And that was how Zionism as a movement got going. But of course, we know that all Jews for centuries, for 2,000 years, have always been davening for Zion, always been davening for V'sech Zena Einenu B'shuv Zion Barachamim, and all of our tefillos have a return to Eretz Yisrael and to Yerushalayim, and every bracha of ala michya and every benching. We're not davening to come to Israel. However, the secular Jews only started this in the late 1800s with the cause of Zionism. I'm not going to get into the whole politics and strife between the religious and the secular over this. In general, the religious Jews were not pro-Zionistic because it was an openly anti-religious movement. They felt that the reason that there was anti-Semitism was because Jews were different, because Jews were, old-fashioned and backwards, and we kept to our old ways, that we would never be able to really fit in among the Goyim. And that's why they wanted Zionism to be like a new Jew, the new type of Jew, not the old-fashioned, halachic Torah Jew. We were going to be a new European Jew. And that's why many of the religious people didn't agree. Rav Kook, we know Avram Yitzchak Kook Zatzal, so he made the synthesis between Zionism and religion and started the Dati Leumi movement, like the Mizrahi movement, the religious Zionist movement. But in general, Zionism was an anti-religious movement, and most religious Jews did not buy into it. Of course, most Jews for, again, centuries wanted to go to Israel. The Vilna Gaon tried to go to Israel. The Ramchal moved to Israel. We always wanted to return to Israel, but not as a political movement, just as a religious directive to be here in the Holy Land, in the Eretz HaKodesh, and do the mitzvahs atuluyos ba'aretz and all of that. Okay, but now back to the Balfour Declaration. So he says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, so Palestine was this region in the Ottoman Empire, right? It was never a country called Palestine. We'll talk about that more. There was never a Palestinian people. There was never a state or a country called Palestine. It was the area that after the Romans defeated the Jews in the Bar Kokhba rebellion following the Churban Bayis Sheni, we know the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and Titus brought all the Kelei HaMikdash, the menorah, and everything back to Rome. But there were still Jewish pockets of resistance throughout Judea, throughout the Jewish area, most famously Bar Kokhba. And when the Bar Kokhba rebellion was put down about 100 years or so after the Churban Bayis, so then that's when Rome completely undid Judea. They renamed it Syria Palestina, which was like a insult to the Jewish people. Like the Plishtim were the previous owners of Israel before Yehoshua came in and conquered Israel and turned it into Eretz Yisrael. So before that, it was the Eretz HaPlishtim. So that's what the Romans did. They reverted the name back from Judea or Israel to Palestina as an insult to the Jewish people. But from then on, that's how this region was referred to, as Palestine. The area was referred to as Palestine throughout all the years until 1948, which we'll get to shortly. So that's why he's saying the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors. The government of England will use its best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, meaning there were always Jews and non-Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. Under the Ottomans, there was a mixture. Many Jewish people were there and tried to move and tried to arrive there and come there, but there obviously were many Arabs that were living there as well. And this is saying that, we're going to set up a Jewish state, but it's not going to interfere with the Arabs. Well, that's exactly what ended up happening, right? Much later, Israel today, we know 20% of our population are non-Jewish people, and they have all the rights of Jewish people. They vote, they're in the Knesset, they're on the Supreme Court, etc. So that's what the Balfour Declaration was promoting. And again, the idea was that if we do this, if the Jewish people are excited about the possibility of having a homeland in Palestine, then they're going to rally around the British cause. They're going to get America to join the war, and they're going to, help Britain win World War I. So that's the Balfour Declaration, and this was something that was seen as massively significant in the world. The Chafetz Chaim apparently said when he heard about the Balfour Declaration, he said, "So it begins," meaning the Geula, right? He thought that this was something that was mamish, like leading to the Geula, which I think it was. We'll see that in the arc of history, Mirz Hashem Bekarov, right? But the Balfour Declaration was something that was extremely, extremely important, and it had a huge impact on the world Jews who saw this as an opportunity to hopefully finally come back and have a homeland over here. Unfortunately, at the exact same time, that the British were doing this to try to get the Jews, they were doing the exact same thing to the Arabs. Okay, this is another letter that was written a couple of years before the Balfour Declaration. And this is a letter that was written to Hussein. Now, Hussein was like the head of many of the Arab tribes that lived in the area which is now Saudi Arabia. And like I said before, the British were the whole time throughout World War I trying to rally the Arabs to rise up and fight against the Palestinians. So they encouraged the Arabs' nationalism. Nationalism is the idea of people deserve their own land, people deserve to be their own people, they shouldn't be subject of other people. And this type of talk really rallied the Arabs, and the British promised them also that if they would rise up against the Ottomans, so then they would also get their own lands, right? And this is what this is saying over here. Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca. Right? Great Britain will guarantee the holy places against all external aggression. All of these things that basically Britain was telling the Arabs that you guys can have your own land and your own people, including Israel, right? Meaning they literally promised the same stretch of land to two different people. If one would say what the real source or the core or the beginning of the entire Arab-Israeli conflict is, it's Britain's double dealing. And we'll see in a second that they were actually triple dealing. On the one hand, they were promising the Arabs land, that exact same land they were promising to the Jews, right? And really, they had no intention of doing either, right? This map over here on the top is the map that the Arabs and the British had decided upon. And all of these places were, designated for the Arabs. This was going to be Iraq. This was going to be, what became Saudi Arabia, all these different places. However, at the exact same time, right? So they're promising Israel to the Jews. They're promising everything to the Arabs. But at the same time, there was something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Okay, Sykes was the British foreign minister. Picot was the French foreign minister. And they had decided on their own in a back dealing, right, in a secret deal, that really they were going to carve up the entire Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, after they would win the war. They were going to divide up the Middle East among themselves. And this is how they saw their map, right? That the French would get this entire area coming down all the way to Lebanon and a big chunk of Syria, that the British would get this area, southern Israel and Jordan, Iraq, and all of this. Saudi Arabia, they were going to give to the Arabs. That area, they were going to actually stand by their word. But the rest of this whole area was already decided on between Sykes and Picot to divide up among themselves. And this was a totally secret alliance that was made in the background. So basically in 1915, they promise everything to the Arabs. In 1916, they decide that they're really going to keep most of it for themselves. And in 1917, they promise Israel to the Jews. That's the chronology of what happened. This came out, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, because in 1916, in addition to the war going on, that's when the Russian revolution happened, the Bolshevik revolution. Russia used to be under the Tsar Nicholas. He was like the king of Russia, and he was a bad guy, anti-Semite and all of that, a very bad person and terrible to the Jews. And the Bolsheviks were the communists, and there was a revolution that took place during World War I. And when the Bolsheviks took over, they killed the family of the Tsar and all of that. They were also terrible, violent people. Unfortunately, many of them were Jews. As we know, many of the big communists were Jews, which is what's going to lead into anti-Semitism that's going to lead up to World War II. However, at this point, they took over Russia, and they blew the whistle on this. They showed the world that really Britain and France had no interest in giving the countries away to the other nationalities. Really, they were trying to divide it up themselves, and this secret agreement ended up becoming public after the Russian Revolution, and that also caused a very, very big controversy. Okay, but meanwhile, the Jewish people did rally to help the British win World War I. World War I was completed. The Central Powers were defeated, and the Ottoman Empire disappeared. That's it. There was no more Ottoman Empire, and now it was time to actually divvy up all of these lands and all of these places. So while Israel originally was supposed to be under international control, that only lasted for a tiny amount of time, a year or two, and then it became a British colony. Okay, so basically in 1917, 1918, once World War I is over, so Israel becomes a British colony. Okay, the rest of the Middle East was, some of it was given to the Arabs, some of it was still controlled by the other countries, but Israel itself became a British colony, and that's known as the British Mandate period, from 1917 until 1948, the end of World War I until Israel's independence, which we'll get to in a minute. That's when Israel was under British control. And literally, over every building that was an important building, there was a British flag, there were British police officers, there was British army that was here in Israel. It was completely and totally run by the British during this time period. And this is when the land became known as Palestine. That's when this area, this specific area with these borders of what we today call Israel, then that's when that area became known as Palestine. Again, it wasn't a country. It wasn't its own place. It was under British control, a British colony, so to speak, just like India was at that time, just like many other countries were under the colonial powers of that time. So Israel was a colony of the British. During this time, this is when people started moving in much, much more robustly, right? You could see here, this is like a chart of how the immigration happened, and it wasn't just Jewish people that started moving in great numbers after World War I, right? The Arabs also started pouring in from other countries, meaning just like most of the Jews that are here today in Israel were not from here originally. There are, of course, Jews that have been here for many, many generations and have always lived here, but the vast majority of the Jews that are here moved here from Europe and from other countries, right? That's another one of these things that you always hear the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists say, go back to Europe. You're blonde, white-skinned people with blue eyes. You don't belong in the Middle East. You're not native to the Middle East. You should go back to Europe, go where you came from. The truth of the matter is that most of the Palestinians, quote unquote, also moved here during that time period. This was a totally, totally backwater place until after World War I. There was no industry in Israel. There was no farming in Israel. There was nothing that was attractive for anybody to want to live here or be here. However, once the Jews started pouring in after World War I, specifically because of anti-Semitism that was growing in Russia, anti-Semitism that was growing in other places in Europe, and Jewish people tried to move here in huge numbers. You could see that, before World War I, there were 65,000 Jews here. Within a couple of years, there's 93,000, then 113,000, then 175,000. By the time Hitler comes into power in Germany, there are already almost 200,000 Jews here. And then the numbers just almost go up, not quite exponentially, but it grows by 100,000 or more, through the years after leading up to World War II. Many, many Jewish people left Germany and the countries in Austria and came here. And then until finally after World War II, then more people came. But the same thing happened with the Arabs. Once the land here started to become more useful and the Jewish people started making farms and the Jewish people started opening up industry here and the Jewish people started cultivating the land, so then tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Arabs also moved in from all over the place, from all different countries, from Algeria, from Morocco, from Egypt. Just like Jewish people came from other places, so too hundreds of thousands of Arabs came from other places. And it's a myth. It's a myth to say that the Palestinians who are here today are descendants of the Canaanites or whatever. That's total baloney. The vast majority of the people that call themselves today Palestinians are people that were moved here during the same exact time period as when most of the Jewish people moved here, because for the first time in centuries, this was a place that had where to make money and how to live better, and the quality of life was improving under British governance. But the Jewish people were the ones that cultivated the land and made it more profitable to be here. So this was a time period that many people moved, Jews and non-Jews alike. Now, during this time period, again, during the British Mandate, so we have the British are running the show here. There's Jews and non-Jews that are pouring in. This was, they tried to stop Jewish people from coming in because the Arabs were very upset about it. This is when the tensions really started to grow between Arabs and Jews in Israel. This is the time period during the 1920s when it really started. The first anti-Jewish riot that broke out was like in 1920, called the Nabi Musa riots that happened. And throughout the 20s, there were many clashes between Jews and Arabs, between Arabs and British, and between the Jews and the British. This was a time period where there were Jewish people that were doing terrorist attacks against the British. People compare this all the time. They say, we say that the Palestinian terrorists who want their freedom are terrorists when they say they're freedom fighters. Well, we also did that. We also attacked the British and bombed places and did all sorts of immoral seeming things in order to try to get the British out of Palestine during this time period. Now, halachically, it's very questionable whether all of that was okay or not. There are many people, there's different ways of looking at it. However, there certainly were things that were done that were not appropriate and not okay. Bombing the King David Hotel, which killed dozens and dozens of British people. That was a very famous terrorist act that was committed by Jews. There are many acts of terrorism that happened during that time period. However, there were never any pogroms against the Arabs. There was never a time that the Jewish people went through the streets of Arab villages and butchered them and killed them, whereas that happened several times the other way around. Like we spoke about last week, in 1929, the terrible Hebron massacre happened, where, based on lies that the Jewish people were trying to take over Al-Aqsa Mosque, they were going to try to take over the Har HaBayis, and there were real riots, and it was literally a pogrom of Arab people going through the streets, butchering people, chopping off their heads, and everything like what we heard about what happened on October 7th. It's been going on for 100 years. The exact same types of tactics. The same people's grandparents did it in the 1920s. But this was like the most turbulent time in Israel, Palestine. This is also the time. I want to one second. I want to see if I could show you this these pictures over here. I don't know. Can you? I can't. I don't know if you could see this now. Let me see it. 1 second. I have to maybe. 1 second. I'm going to stop the share and try to show something else here. 1 second. And okay, but this is during the time period where there's many times that you find the Palestinians today with these self-owns, what they call, when they'll say, oh, there was never a state of Palestine, there was never a country. Well, how about this? And they'll show a picture of Palestinian, it says Palestine, come visit Palestine, and those types of things. But it was all Jewish. Anything that was Palestine during that time period from 1917 to 1948, anything that was Palestinian or called Palestine or anything like that. Let me see if I could put these into the chat. 1 second. I'll see if I could drag some of these pictures into the chat. Right. Anything that was Palestinian during that time was Jewish. Right. Here. So I just put a bunch of things into the chat. Right. There was the Palestine Post. Well, that's the Jerusalem Post today. It was a Jewish newspaper. It wasn't an Arab newspaper. This is a poster here about come visit Palestine and tour. It's in Hebrew, right? The Jewish people during this time period were called the Palestinians. Palestine was Israel. There's also a famous one that they show about, there was never a country of Palestine. So how did they have a soccer team, a football team that played against other countries? It's all Jewish people in the pictures. You literally see Magen Davids on their shirts. I'll drop a link into the chat also. This is a link about all these self-owns, all of these things that the Palestinians try to show us, of course there was a Palestine, of course there was a country, who did this and who did that, and it's all Jewish things, all of it. Any single time that they show anything about Palestine during that time period, trying to prove that there was a Palestinian state, it's only always Jews that they're showing. Like the mamish don't realize it. They'll show a picture of the Palestinian football team, and it's all guys with Magen Davids on their shirts and names like Abramoff and Schwartz and Cohen and things like this. And it's the Palestinians during that entire time period were the Jews. The Arabs were called Arabs because they were a whole mixture of people, like I said, that came from all over the place, from all different places. There was no such thing as the Palestinian people. There was no such thing as an indigenous group of people that lived here. There was a group of many, many different types of people that came from all over, all over North Africa in order to move here. Okay. Anyway, this was the time period between, again, World War I and World War II. After World War II ended in 1945, and the world saw just the incredible enormity of the Holocaust and how nobody had stepped in to save the Jews, and nobody would take in the Jews, even though there are tens of thousands of visa permits that went unfilled in America, and Britain and all these other places barely did anything to help us. So there was obviously a very, very high level of sympathy for Jewish people and the Jewish cause right after World War II. The world was shocked by the Holocaust. They were shocked at the extent of the death and devastation and the numbers of people that were killed, men, women, children, entire communities, entire countries that had been flourishing with Jewish people. And after the Holocaust, there was nobody left at all. That's when world sympathy turned much, much more towards the Jewish people for a very brief period of time. That, together with the fact that the British were getting really fed up with being here in Palestine. There were more policemen in Israel than in the entire of India, right? I don't know if you know how big India is relative to Israel. Israel's this tiny little sliver of land, and India is an enormous, enormous country. And the British people needed more manpower in Israel than in the entire India in order to try to keep the peace, because there was all of this fighting going on between the Arabs and the Jews, and the Jews and the British, and the Arabs and the British. And it was a very, very bad time for the British. And basically that, together with this incredible amount of sympathy for the Jews, so that's when the partition plan was put forward. Okay, the partition plan, let's go back up to the first map that we saw. The partition plan was set forth by the world, by the UN. It was voted on by the UN, and the UN plan was for Israel, the land of Israel, to be partitioned, to be separated. And it would look like this, that there would be a separate piece of land, two pieces or three pieces, 1, 2, 3, that would be for the Arabs that were here. And all of this white would be the Jewish country, right? There would be a place for the Jews to be. And most of this was desert, by the way, like the entire south of Israel. This entire thing is desert, right? Anybody who's ever driven to Eilat from Yerushalayim. So, for the first little while, you drive through places, but then once you get past Beersheba, it's nothing, right? There's desert all the way down to Eilat, 2-3 hours worth of just desert, right? So the vast majority of what they were offering us was just desert. The coast was very valuable, right? That's where Haifa was, and Tel Aviv, and those types of places. That was very valuable real estate, that's for sure. But the vast majority of the actual square mileage of what was supposed to be Israel was desert. And Palestine was going to be this area, and this area. And Jerusalem was going to be under international control. Jerusalem was going to be, held by the international community so that everybody could worship there and everybody could, have rights over there. So this was the famous UN partition plan that was voted on in 1947. The world agreed, the UN by a vote agreed that this is how it should look. The Israelis, the Jewish people were ecstatic. They accepted it. They were disappointed. Obviously, they would have wanted more land and a better looking place and not just desert. But they said, "We'll take it. We'll take it, and we'll make the desert bloom." Right? That was the famous line that they said. We're going to make it work. We're going to make it happen. And the Jewish people accepted it. The Arabs did not. Categorically, they rejected it, and they said, "No, no partition, no Jewish homeland, nothing for the Jews at all." So what happened was in 1948, when the British officially left, right, they declared a certain date that they're going to be leaving. This is when Yom Ha'atzmaut is, right, Hey Iyar. So they said, that's it, we're leaving. And the British flag came down and all the British police left and the British troops left. So Israel had been preparing for this for months, right, even years. They were ready. They were ready to declare their own state, to declare their own country. They had the infrastructure. They had a tiny little army to defend themselves. but they were ready for this. They were ready to create a new state of Israel on a tiny bit of land. One of the things that the Arabs said, and you may hear this also as an argument, and it's just important to point this out, they said it's really not fair. This is an unfair breakup, because if you look at the numbers of people that were here at the time, right, in 1948, there were still more Arabs than Jews, like double the amount of Jews than Arabs. So why are we getting only half the land, right? There's 650,000 Jews and 1.3 million Arabs, right? It's not fair that they should get half and half, right? Let's make it proportionate. The reason that that's ludicrous and ridiculous is because the entire world understood that this was going to be the place where all the Jews that were in camps all over Europe, displaced person camps after the war, they were all going to come here, right? There were about 1 million Jews that were stuck, languishing in camps with nowhere to go. They couldn't go back home. They didn't have any other place to go to. And the whole point of establishing Israel was to have a place for those people to go. So that, I just want you to realize, that's a totally spurious argument what the Arabs make and pro-Palestinian people make, that it's completely unfair, the division of the land that was even presented. Why do you expect the Arabs to accept that? It's totally unfair. They divided it 50-50 when we had more than twice the number of people. Well, yes, that's true. Living there at the time, you had more than twice the number of people, but it was very clearly set up that this was going to be the place for all the Jews who were stuck around the world to come and move to. And then they wouldn't have to go to other countries and have to be at the will of other places. We were willing to accept them here in Israel, and they would live here on the land. Again, the vast majority of which was desert. Still don't forget that, right? The more built up places and places that were much better for living went to the Palestinians. Again, some of it did go to us. However, that 50-50 split for this uneven population is a total stupidity. It's a total myth. The point of it was to be a place for all the other Jews to have a place to go to. Okay, anyway, as we know, what happened was the Arabs did not accept this. On 1948, the day after Israel declared independence, the Arab armies invaded. All of them, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iraq, from Jordan, from Egypt. They all invaded, and literally it was a battle to try to wipe out the Jews. It was explicitly said. 1 second, I'll try to show this to you here. Here, we could read this quote. There's a very powerful quote that was, famously said over here. The Secretary General of the Arab League, who was the person who was like in charge of the Arab forces, he wrote, "This war will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongol massacres and the Crusades." Okay, so he literally was open about this. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't like something that they were trying to hide. They said explicitly, Israel's going to declare a state, and we're just going to wipe out all the Jews. It's going to be, and they were proud of it. They were proud, like the Mongols and the Crusaders, who were, these are evil butchers that we look down upon, right? But they were making themselves like proudly, we're going to do that. So in 1948, we know there was a massive war. All the Arab armies invaded from all the different sides, and miraculously, literally miraculously, nisim v'niflos, that the Jewish people were able to fight them off. They were able to not only fight off the Arabs from the lands that had been theirs. 1 second, I want to go back up to those maps, right? But also they ended up with more land, right? That's what's happening over here in the top map, right? You see the UN plan in 1947 was for all of this to be part of Palestine, and big chunks of this to be part of Palestine, right? And up here to be part of Palestine. But after that war, we pushed them back further. So Gaza remained Arab, the West Bank, so to speak, remained Arab, and the north we took over. And this little bit came into halfway across Yerushalayim, right? This is West and East Jerusalem. Jerusalem was split at that time because the Arabs took the old city and the eastern part, the Jordanian army, and the western part was still for the Jews. So from 1949 until 1967, this is how Israel looked. These were not official borders. This is just where the fighting stopped, right? This is like these borders were the places where the truce was called and the fighting stopped. However, throughout the entire time, there were still attacks coming from both directions. The Palestinians is well known, the Jordanians at that time, who were the Palestinians, so they would be shooting at people down from the Yerushalayim into the western area of Yerushalayim. And this is what they said after their conquering of Yerushalayim. They first now took over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you should just know, Yerushalayim was majority Jewish, Always. There was, I mean, I don't know if there was ever a time, maybe except for the little few years after the Churban, but Yerushalayim was almost always a majority of Jews. Even throughout the Ottoman Empire, there were Jews that were living there. And the Jordanian commander, this is a famous line also, he said, after they took over Yerushalayim, they kicked out all the Jews, they destroyed 58 shuls, they completely leveled anything that was Jewish in the Jewish quarter. And he wrote, for the first time in 1,000 years, not a single Jew remains in the Jewish quarter. Not a building remains intact. This makes the Jews' return here impossible, right? So first of all, there's a few things going on in this statement. First of all, again, they're admitting openly to ethnic cleansing, right? That famous word that everyone accuses the Jews of doing. He's openly saying, yes, we proudly ethnically cleansed Jerusalem of Jews. They leveled everything, and he's also admitting that Jews were there for 1,000 years. Right now, for the first time, he's proudly saying that for 1,000 years, Jews have been here, and now there's not any more. So again, like all those people who say the Jewish people just showed up here, and we only started when Zionism started in the late 1800s, and it's just a sheker. It's just a sheker, and all the Arabs in that time knew this. They all knew who we were and what the Jews were doing here, and that the Jews were always here. They were proud of the fact that Jerusalem was Judenrein, right? There were no Jews left in Yerushalayim after 1,000 years. Okay, so this was what happened in 1948, and Israel stayed in that picture of the way that it was when the fighting stopped for about 20 years. What happened was in 1967, that's when the Arab armies again invaded from all three sides, Egypt from the south, Syria and Lebanon from the north, and the Jordanians from the east rather. And again, that's the 6-day war. And the 6-day war, Israel won again. And not only did we end up taking over Gaza, we ended up getting the entire Sinai Peninsula, right, in 1967. The entire Sinai Desert was ours. The Golan Heights became ours. And that's when they say the quote-unquote occupation began. What does that mean, the occupation? That means that the Jews fought back the Jordanian army to the Jordan River, and Jordan now is stuck on the other side. And then Jewish people were now in control of this area, which again, it was nobody's land. It was the Ottoman Empire, and then it was British, and then it was Jordanian. Jordan was occupying that area. If Jordan wanted to, they had many years that they could have set up a Palestinian state, but they didn't. They had many years that they could have, helped the Palestinians and done that, but they didn't. They just occupied them and had them under their control. And now the Jews kicked out the Jordanian fighters. So now this area became quote unquote occupied by the Jewish people. But still the Palestinians lived there. The Arabs lived there. It was not an occupation with checkpoints and army control and all of that. That only started in the 1980s when the Intifada began. The Intifada was an Arab uprising. We're skipping through a lot of time here with Arafat and the PLO in the 1970s and all of that. Arafat himself was an Egyptian. He wasn't quote unquote Palestinian. Yasser Arafat, Yamach Shemo. But once the uprisings began and the Palestinians started becoming violent and killing us, so that's when the quote unquote occupation began. Occupation is us protecting ourselves from Arabs who are dead set on killing us. That's what it is. And the same thing happened with Gaza. In 2005, the Jews left Gaza completely. It was supposed to be land for peace, right? The whole world was telling us for years, if we just give them back their land, not back, if we give them the land, so then, we'll have peace with them. And in 2005, Israel left Gaza completely. And from 2005 till 2007, Gaza was its own place. There was no blockade. It was not an open air prison. It wasn't a concentration camp or anything like that. What happened is that in 2006, they voted Hamas into power. And Hamas immediately started using Gaza as a base to launch terror attacks against Israel. So Israel said, well, we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to just let Gaza sit as a place where anything can come and go, and every bit of material that they get, they're going to just use to kill us. So that's when Israel imposed its blockade with Egypt, right? Egypt has also a border with Gaza, and Egypt has also kept their border closed with Gaza. Egypt cooperates with Israel in the blockade of Gaza, because Egypt also knows that these are terrorists and people that if we give them anything, they're going to use it against us and use it to kill us. People say that the Simchas Torah attack, October 7th, happened because of the blockade. It's the exact opposite. The blockade is because of that. if there wouldn't be this blockade on Gaza, this is what they would be doing all the time. This is what they want to do, what they are dead set on doing. It's in their charter that they will wipe out Israel. They don't want peace. Peace is not part of what their platform is. So it's really hard to understand what the world expects us to do exactly. Like, what do they expect us to do? Just to let these people live over there, free when whatever freedom they have, they use against us. It's really a very bizarre situation. And the entire narrative that is formed, it only makes sense if you believe that Israel is a murderous, hateful, genocidal, Nazi-like country, which they do. That's mamish what they do. They think we are Nazis the way that we treat the Palestinians, and they have no idea of the history. They have no idea of the ways that the Palestinians have been for decades and decades and decades, avoiding any possibility for peace. Anytime there's a peace offering, there's 6 or 7 different deals, the Oslo Accords, the Camp David Accords, all of these things. Every single time there was any sort of peace plan offered, they reject it. And so we are in a very, very terrible situation here in Israel. It's mamish, we're stuck. We can't make peace with them because they're unwilling to make peace. I feel bad for the Palestinians that want to make peace. I'm sure there are some, but they'll be killed by their own people. Nobody could stand up in Hamas and say, no, we want peace, we want peace. They'll kill them right away. And the same thing in the West Bank. There's no freedom for any Palestinians. I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know how it's going to ever change. You have a group of people that is just absolutely set on violence and set on belligerence and set on continuously fighting this war. And and we're the bad guys for trying to defend ourselves from it. Now, does that mean that every single thing we do is justified? No, I'm sure that there are many things that are done by soldiers in individual places that are humiliating and unnecessary and not okay, and all of those things. I get it, and I'm sure that happens, and those are the things that are always pointed out, in news articles and things like that. But we have to zoom out and see the big picture. The big picture is we've been dealing for decades with this genocidal group of people that are set on killing us. We were totally fooled by Hamas. We actually thought that because we were giving them 20,000 work permits a day and letting people work in Israel and letting the things go in Gaza much, much more easily, that the Gazans would be happy and that they would be financially secure and then they would be okay. And it was all a sham. It was all a ruse. It was all a joke. Hamas was laughing at us the entire time. They spent these past 2 years using their workers coming into Israel to plot this attack. Literally, that's what was happening. We were giving them and helping them and being, coming to compromise. And they were taking everything we were giving them, laughing at us for our weakness, and preparing for this incredible butchery that they pulled off miraculously a few weeks ago. And this is what we've been dealing with now for decades. If anybody, anybody has a different plan, a better way of making this work, we're all ears. It just all the liberal and progressive leftist plans to make it work are all fantasies, because they are all based on the idea that, well, if we would just be nice to them, then they would be nice to us. But that's just not true. Since before there was a state, since before there was anything, they've been against us and trying to kill us. It's a religious war as far as they are concerned. We just want to live here in peace. We just want to be here and do our thing. Like I said, there are 2 million Arabs that live in Israel. They're on the Supreme Court. My rheumatologist is an Arab. The pharmacist I use is an Arab. So many people are, and we get along fine with them. They, maybe is there racism? Okay, there's racism in every country, right? But that's not the institutional setup of the country. To say that it's an apartheid country is absurd. Whenever they say that, it's a trick. They're really talking about the people in the West Bank, because they don't have rights. The Arabs in the West Bank don't have rights. That's true. That's because there's no government who will take them. They won't accept us as their government. They don't want to be citizens of Israel, and the PA, the Palestinian Authority, doesn't do anything for them. So you're right, they're left in a limbo, but the limbo is not our fault. What should we do? We should leave the West Bank also and let them just, again, just amass weapons so that they could attack us further. The apartheid wall, they call it, the separation wall that was built, that was because there was suicide bombings every few days, right? In the 1990s, it was in a ridiculous situation, and people were afraid to take buses, and thousands of Israelis were killed. So we stopped it. We defended ourselves by building a wall. Now, is it possible that some of the parts of that wall are not fair, that it cuts through an Arab person's field and it doesn't let him get to his, yeah, that's very possible. It's a very sad, unfortunate byproduct of a very sad, unfortunate situation. But unless somebody has a better solution for us, unless somebody has a better way of how to deal with a group of people that are committed to our destruction, that live on our borders, I don't know what else to do or say. I'm not sure what the world expects from Israel to do. And the fact that after this happened now, that we, to me, I was just, I thought it was obvious that after this attack, the world would like understand a little bit more. The world would be like, oh boy, wow, now I see what they've been up against. The fact that so many people are taking the opposite stance and like saying, oh, well, it's justified. And what do you expect? And it's just mind-boggling to me. It's mind-boggling. It's like, I don't know, it's like a nace. I wish I understood it better, but that's the overview. That's the overview of how we got to where we are today in a nutshell. It was never their land, never. It was never their country, ever. It was the Ottomans, and then it was the British. And even during that time, like I said, it was hundreds of thousands of Arabs that came in from other places, not that they've been living here and it's their indigenous homeland. It's not, right? Even if you don't accept the Torah and if you don't accept our claim to being indigenous over here, right? Even if you don't accept that, the Arabs are no more indigenous than we are. At the same time that the mass amount of Jews came in, that's when the mass amount of Arabs came in also. There's just no two ways about it. And history is just completely distorted by these myths that Arafat conducted. Arafat created this whole myth of the Palestinian people, and he was extremely successful at convincing the world that there's this Palestinian cause and Palestinian, homeland and all of these things. And it's mamish myth. Okay, if there are any questions, I'll take some questions.
Rabbi Rosenstein, I'm curious if you ever have engaged with any of the younger people, like the woke type of people that have decided to start voicing an opinion, because I'm just curious, do any of them know anything? Like when I see these pictures on the news of them holding up signs like apartheid state, I'm like, what do you even know about Israel? That's what I find so interesting. Like, how are you just jumping on this bandwagon? It's like, I guess you could just hold up a sign and like try to be on their side, but there's so much history behind it, like you just went through. Like if you would ask them, I feel like it's like those comedians that like go around like New York City, like asking questions about like the president. Like if you would ask them anything about Israel or Arabs, I feel like it's like a blank slate.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. And this whole thing from the river to the sea, right? The river, that's
right. Like if you would ask them like what river and what sea, like do you even know like what you're talking
they would
about?
have no idea. But from the river to the sea is literally here, the Jordanian River to the sea, meaning no more Jews. Wipe out the Jews. That's what it means. It's like unbelievable. Like, what used to be an open call for genocide, right? Like I said, the Arab armies were not shy about this at all. They're very proud of what they were planning on doing, which is literally wiping us out after the Holocaust, just like, finishing us off. I didn't even get into the whole thing about how the leader of the Palestinians in the 20s and 30s, I spoke about it last week, how he went to Germany, visited concentration camps, he sat with Hitler. Like they literally sided with Hitler. They literally sided with the Nazis. And we're supposed to, and we're supposed to make peace with them when they don't want to have peace with us. It really makes no sense. Yes, the answer is no. They have no idea what they're talking about. The people that are going around and saying these things, it's just to them another social justice cause. And just like they don't know anything about George Floyd and they don't know anything about anything, so they don't know anything about this either. It's just a catchphrase. It's just very easy to see what looks like an oppressed people, and it does look like they're oppressed. It does. However, there's a reason for that. There's a reason. It's like, there are many comics I'm sure that you've seen, like some kid, doing things and breaking things. And then the teacher says, go stand in the corner. And somebody comes in, how dare you? How dare you do that to this kid? Like it makes no sense. It makes no sense. To me, until this past 2 weeks, I was one of those people who thought that anti-Semitism was like overplayed and people used it too much and all of that. I don't know anymore. I really don't know anymore. To me, I don't see, there are Syria in Assad in Syria, right? But to the north of Israel, he's killed close to 1 million Muslims. right, over the past few years during the civil war that he has, including tens of thousands of Palestinians, literally tens of thousands, not Hamas tens of thousands, real tens of thousands. And like nobody cares. Nobody's, you know what I mean? Nobody's marching against him. Nobody's making any big deal about it. It's just us. It's mamish just us. And you know, I don't know what it is if it's not anti-Semitic. I don't know. Yeah, Julie, what do you want to say?
So first of all, also I like to put my camera on sometimes, but I can't right now because we're in the car and it's like pitch black. My sister and I are here listening, so thank you so much. I wanted to ask you, like, first of all, yes, everything amazing. First, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I also just wanted to throw out there the prayers for Palestine. There's like some amazing,
It's
yeah,
crazy.
I know. It's crazy. There's amazing things online about it, showing comparisons of like, here's what happens if you walk into Palestine. Like,
it's not just walking to Palestine. A few months ago, there was a story in the news, and I can't tell you how many times I've sent this to people on Twitter. A few months ago, there was a gay Palestinian kid that left and was getting asylum in Israel, right? They hunted him down, found him, and beheaded him. And then in the BBC article about it, it was like unbelievable. In the BBC article about it, it said, you know, like, you know, homosexuality is you know, very much looked down upon in both Israeli and Jewish, you know, Muslim religious. It was like unbelievable that they like somehow brought us into it. Somehow they brought whatever. It's crazy. It's mamish crazy. But yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that's crazy. Wow. So I guess what is interesting to me is seeing how a lot of mainstream media, I don't know, I think the phrase is like legacy media. I don't know, like a lot of like the main places are kind of seeming to side with Israel, even with people like saying things straight out of BBC, saying like, how dare you, shame on you, things like that. Or like, I don't know this guy's name, Kirby. I don't know, the one that was like speaking, it's not the woman that has a French name for Biden, but the other guy that was saying like, he said like Biden's not gonna apologize for saying that people are gonna die in war. I don't know if you saw that. There was like literally, I think it was like literally yesterday, but he was like,
Yes,
you know,
yes, I
Biden
did.
was not being.
Yes, I saw that. Yes.
Okay, fine. Yeah. So yeah, I was like, it just happened. So I don't even know like timing wise, but I thought that was pretty amazing. He's like, no, harsh is what Hamas did, but that I'm also kind of like, you know, is this an illusion? Like, is this something that would happen for Mashiach, or like, is that all gonna like just go away real fast?
I'll tell
a
you.
lot of other people. You know,
my thoughts on that. I have a few different thoughts about this. First of all, yes, I mean, look, you know, everybody wants Mashiach to come. If this is a part of that, halavai, we'll know that only in retrospect. You know what I mean? Halavai, it's Chazal say that the, you know, and the Navi says that the final battle before Mashiach is going to be over Yerushalayim. You know what I mean? So you know, it's hard to picture how that would happen, except now. You know, like. You know, this whole thing was called the Al-Aqsa invasion, or whatever they called it, Hamas. You know, it was over Yerushalayim, ostensibly, you know, so we could easily see how when the Navi is written about all of this afterwards, that it's you know, a world war over Jerusalem. You know, however, I will just say about what you said about the media, I'm definitely one of those people who is very, very, very skeptical of politicians and the legacy media and the military-industrial complex, like that whole cabal of people who make billions of dollars on war and are very much pro-war because it's very good for their bank accounts. And to me, there's no question about it that, you know, going all the way back to Iraq, I mean, I was alive and paying attention when the Iraq war happened and all of that, and how unbelievably complicit the media was in just going along with the narrative in order to get us into war. And to me, I don't know if I see it as sympathy towards Jews and Israel as much as pro-war, you know what I mean, and just, you know, wanting for there to be a bigger war with Iran. I really don't know. I really don't know. So I'm not so eager to accept their help on this, just because I don't know that their agenda is really the same as ours. I feel like if the agenda would fit them better to be against us, they would do that in a heartbeat. You know, so
yeah. Well, do you, I mean, a lot of people are saying that, like, online. So people are saying like, like, don't be fooled. You don't have to come out and say like you're pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian. This is really just the media taking you for another run. Similarly, the same way they took us for a run with some other things recently. I was saying with COVID, like people are going to say that. So I've seen this also online, like the military industry complex. But then that just kind of gets perceived a little bit as like anti-Semitic because people are just saying, why
Yeah,
can't you just take our side?
it's not so black and white and so simple and binary like that. You know what I mean? It's I certainly don't think it's anti-Semitic for somebody who is skeptical of, all of a sudden why so many people are so into wanting to see a bigger war over here. That certainly, calls for skepticism. There's also this whole Christian fundamentalist worldview that some people have in Congress and the government that they believe in some end time war in the Middle East that's going to bring Jesus back. And I don't know how much of that is playing a role here either. I just don't know.
Yeah, but is that so bad? My dad says that sometimes actually. Like, is that such a problem?
Well, it is, just because it's dishonest. You know what I mean? It's not actually that they care about Jewish lives and Jewish land and Israel. If we are seen as like a means to their end. So again, like maybe our interests are now coinciding, but I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, because if our interests wouldn't coincide, then they wouldn't side with us. So I'm not so quick to just like jump on that bandwagon.
Okay,
You know what I mean?
right, yeah.
To me, I think that the ADL has been pretty good about this past thing, except when they posted that it's the white supremacists are taking advantage of this situation, when it's clearly leftists who are way more taking advantage of the situation to promote anti-Semitism. But I don't trust Jonathan Greenblatt and the ADL at all, and I think that they're the cause of a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism, the way that they've been labeling people for the past 5 years, as anti-Semites and canceling people and all of these things. So I'm very hesitant about joining up forces with people or groups or organizations that I don't think are really on the same side or same team, and it just happens to be that now our interests coincide. So I think that's something that we have to be very careful and skeptical about. That's what I would say.
I'm just curious, like in Israel, from like, let's say in the Haredi world, I don't know if people, like, given the situation, if they're like heavily trying to follow what's going on, or dafka not. Also, like in other countries, like in the US, like their involvement. Sometimes I feel like I wish I knew a little bit more what they were doing, because like for me, I have news blocked on my computer at home and on my phone. But like the second I get to work, I'm just like, should I check? Should I see what's going on? I don't want to be ignorant, It just like I feel like I have this pull all the time. Like what's it doing for me to be like constantly following what's going on? But if I don't, I feel like, not like I need to see like Tfilos are doing something, but like I just want to see how everything's unfolding, and like how else will I know?
Right. Yeah, no, so it's like everything in life. I think there's a balance that you need to find. I think it's wrong to be plugged in totally and following every single little detail and every single thing. And, I don't think that that's healthy or positive. But at the same time, when such a large scale event is unfolding, I do think that, it's worthwhile to be aware of what's going on. So, I think what you're doing sounds healthy, to not have it be on your phone or at home, that it's something that you're able to be checking and looking at and watching and being on top of all the time. And at the same time, from time to time, or, once a day or twice a day or something like that, just to be knowledgeable about what's happening, since it does affect you and your people so closely. I don't think there's anything wrong with following that. Unless for somebody who, if they feel it's like unhealthy for them, there's some people that I've been speaking to are like asking questions, and they feel it's not healthy for them to follow what's going on because it affects them so deeply. So then that's fine. Like so then ask your husband or ask somebody to just give you like updates every now and then on what's happening, but don't follow it if it's having a negative effect,
Well, I guess also like sometimes I want to know, like I don't know how I came across this, but I found an interview. It wasn't BBC, it was one of these other like offshoot like news, liberal news things, and it was literally a woman who interviewed Hamas 2 years ago, and they took her inside the tunnels. And I was like, first off, this is crazy because like how do you know they're going to let you out? But like they were showing her all the tunnels and like explaining everything and then like talking about how they hate Zionists and want to kill everybody. And I was like, so, a lot of emotions. But like
Yes.
I was like, I need to see, like when I dive in, for me, I feel like it's like it helps me connect a little bit just to know like I guess to understand better, understand like the threats that are out there and just, like I guess like really what Hashem can do for all these people, these crazy Hamas people and everything. It's like beyond like a normal human imagination.
Yes, yeah. I think it's a balance. You need to strike a balance. I definitely would not say that you should be totally ignorant about what's going on now. I don't think that that's the right thing. And again, unless it's like really having a negative effect on you. But otherwise, I do think it's important to be somewhat following what's happening in the world. And I think it's important for Jews to realize how much anti-Semitism there is in the world these days and how open it is. And I think that it's it's a sort of like burying your head in the sand if you're ignoring it and not aware of it. At the same time, like if it's too much for you and it's too overwhelming, so then don't do it. But I do think it's appropriate to have knowledge about what's happening right now in the world.
I had a question. Online, I've seen a lot of people talking about like Jewish pride and how you should be like very publicly having Jewish pride and shout it from the rooftops and like everyone should be. And I understand, like obviously we're meant to look different and act different and dress differently. It is it like is it a value to like is it our value to shout it from the rooftops, or like I guess like is there something wrong with wanting to wear a shaitel and a generic looking dress and blend in with everyone else, or like is it something where like we should be valuing this like standing out?
I don't know that there's a value in standing out. I don't know that that's something that you find in the Torah, that we're Chazal, that we're supposed to we're not supposed to assimilate, right? Yeah, that's for sure. But I don't know that there's a value in projecting to everybody that you meet and see that I'm a Jew and I'm different. I don't know that there's a value in that per se. Especially not if you're nervous or concerned or or frightened about that. I don't there are many times throughout our history that we've for better or for worse but it's not I don't think it's wrong to try to not stand out. I don't think that that's the wrong thing to do. If you're confronted about it, so you shouldn't lie about it. You shouldn't there's a crazy video, I don't know if any of you guys saw this yesterday, 2 days ago, I don't know, like some woman on a bike path and there was a car just like blocking the bike path completely, and she just like very politely asked the guy to move. Yeah, you saw that? Yeah. And he's like, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" And she's like, "In fact, I am." "Oh, I knew it, you devils, you that," like, what the heck? You know what I mean? Like, it was just like something crazy. So I think that is a Kiddush Hashem for people to see that these types of interactions are going on in the world today. At the same time, I wouldn't invite that on ourselves, and it's I don't think it's the right thing to put it in people's faces. So I don't I don't think there's anything wrong with not trying to stand out.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Mirz Hashem, everybody should stay safe, daven, and I hope this helps to give you some perspective. Like, sometimes we end up believing the lies because we don't know enough to know why they're lies, So I'm hoping this helps. You want to say something, Stephanie?
Yeah, something that I wanted to ask was, I hear in like videos, interviews of like when people are like confronting like Jewish people, they say like, oh, like you think you're the chosen nation, but like, aren't we? Like, is that, I don't understand. Can you just like explain that? Like they, like what is that thing like that they like say that like, oh, what, you think you're so good because you're the chosen nation? Like, is that, what is that about?
Okay, so look, as far as Olam Hazeh is concerned, as far as like the world and living in the world and living among non-Jews, so our chosenness is in our the way that we conduct ourselves and the way that we act, and that we should be an example for people, and we should be somebody that people can look up to and see that people who follow God are good people and kind people, and making a Kiddush Hashem. In that respect, but the aspect of us being, Hashem's chosen people, and in a spiritual way, that's not something that we need to also, and that's not something we're supposed to rub in people's faces. That's our spiritual connection to Hashem. In a spiritual way, we're completely and totally different from anybody else. We have a neshama that accesses aspects of the spiritual world that is completely, totally, and separate from anything that the Goyim can do or have. However, that's not what we're supposed to be putting in their faces either. That's between us and Hashem, and our own ruchnius. As far as the chosen people that they'll mock us about. So yeah, I try to be a good person, and I try to be a kind person, and I try to be the type of person that when you see me and you know that I am a follower of God, that you're impressed with the people that follow God. In that respect, we're proud of our chosenness to the Goyim. You know what I mean? But it's not the spiritual aspect of our chosenness has nothing to do with them. You know what I mean? It's not like as opposed to them. They could join us if they want to. They could become a spiritual Jew also if they want to. We're not supposed to be rubbing that in their face. That what I mean? So if somebody says, "Oh, you think you're chosen?" You're like, "Well, yeah, I'm chosen to follow God, and I do my best to be an example of a person who follows God. Yes, that's how I live my life, and I'm quite proud of the fact that I try to reflect God's values in what I do and how I act. But that's not as opposed to you. You can also follow God and reflect God in your actions if you wanted to. Goyim have a purpose and a place, and what they're doing is also something that's important in terms of the physical world and how the world runs. It's only when it comes to spiritual matters that we are completely different. But when it comes to the running of the world and how we interact with each other and with the world, so in that respect, we are not very different than they are. You know what I mean? As far as the physical world and how we deal with it, right? Our whole spiritual existence is something that has nothing to do with them. You hear what I'm saying? So it's we try to be proud of the. I mean, anytime the Gemara talks about the idea of a Kiddush Hashem or a Chilul Hashem, it's always with respect to just like mundane things, right? How we treat people and how we act, and how Goyim see us interacting with the world. It's never about our ruchnius. That's that has nothing to do with them. You know what I mean? So that's how I would say it. Okay, awesome. Okay, I hope this helped everybody. Stay safe, daven, and we'll see you. I'll do maybe something else in the coming weeks. We changed the clocks this week, so it's going to be hard for me to get up at this time next week, but we'll see. Let's say that. All right, great to see you all. Have a great Shabbos. I'll just leave you with one thing. I'm sorry, just one quick thing. I'll leave you just with this, just like an idea from the Parsha. I don't know if anybody saw this. I put this on my status in WhatsApp. It's unbelievable. The Ramban on this week's Parsha says something unbelievable, something that you and I could never say. Right, but it says when Hagar was like she became pregnant from Avram, right, and she was like disparaging Sarah, right? She started looking down at Sarah because like, look, I got pregnant and you couldn't get pregnant, and Sarah's response was to oppress her. it says vata'aneha, right? That Sarah oppressed her, and Rashi says like she started working her much harder and giving her harder work to do. Vativrach mipaneh, so Hagar ran away, and the Ramban says something unbelievable about this. The Ramban says that this was a chait, right? Chata imenu b'davar zeh, that Sarah imenu sinned, and also Abraham by letting it happen and not stepping up and standing in and saying, hey, you shouldn't be treating Hagar like this. And he says, and therefore Hashem heard Hagar's tefillah and gave her a son that's going to oppress us in every which way of oppression. That's mamish what he says. But the whole inui, right, in every which way of oppression, Hagar got a son that got us back. You know what I mean? So like you see this incredible thing when it came to the Avos and the Imahos, everything they did was so significant, right? Every one of their mitzvos is, affects us for generations, and everything that they did becomes a part of us. But Rahman al-Atzlan, right? Even their mistakes, so to speak, right? I could never say that they did a chait from just looking at the Chumash, but the Ramban says it, and like it's unbelievable, especially what's going on today. So my lesson from that is you just see how important it is to treat people right. You know what I mean? To treat people with respect, and even people who are not so nice to you, right? But to treat people with respect, to treat people with tolerance, and you know what I mean? And you just see the incredible ramifications of, right, what Sarah and Abraham did to this person, and we're literally suffering through the ramifications of it still till today. Very, very powerful idea in the Parsha. But all right, great to see you all. Have a great night. Good Shabbos. Bye-bye.
Thank you.